Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Demetra Nightingale, and I direct the Urban Institute's Federal Evidence Forum, which we're now in our 6th year. And I'm very pleased to welcome all of you who are joining us from across the country, from federal government agencies and from other countries as well, for this next in a series of public virtual forums related to evidence-based policies and programs. Today's forum is focusing on data infrastructure issues relevant to evidence building, which I'll say something about in a minute. The Urban Institute's Evidence Forum is generously funded by the Annie E. Casey Foundation and the William T. Grant Foundation, and we thank them greatly for their support. First, a few housekeeping notes. On the slide, the event is being recorded. The recording and all relevant links will be posted online after the event. Biographies for the speakers and all of the slides shown are available online in the event page. We have closed caption turned on for those of you who wish to use it. And if you'd like to adjust your settings or remove the captions, just click the live transcription button, which is usually on the bottom in Zoom. All of you are muted, but you can type comments or questions into the Q&A box in Zoom at any time, and we'll be collecting and trying to address them as we go along. At the end of the event, please take 1 or 2 minutes to complete a survey that you'll get, and this really helps us to plan future forums and events. Finally, engage with us online by using #live@urban. We have a great program today. In a few minutes, I'll turn it over to our guest speaker first, Erica Groshen, and the panel discussants. The 2019 Foundations for Evidence-Based Policy Act, or the Evidence Act, requires nearly all federal agencies to have and strengthen their evidence-based approaches. They are at various stages in the process, producing high-quality evidence with data, statistical analysis, research, evaluations, developing learning agendas and evaluation plans, disseminating reports and results, and engaging stakeholders at every stage. Today, we're focusing on data, especially infrastructure issues. Data, of course, are not evidence in and of themselves, but data are critical inputs or sources that are needed to build evidence. And there are many different types of evidence: program evaluations, government and other statistical reports, research analysis, performance measurement, data analytics, and others. All require the use of some form of data. We're going to talk mainly about quantitative or statistical data, but certainly qualitative and experiential information and data are also important for building evidence. And we are also primarily focusing on the federal government agencies, their issues and capacity around data, but state, local, and private entities are also key data partners, and we will mention them as well. When I was at the US Department of Labor's Chief Evaluation Office, I spent at least half of my time every day, every month, every week on data, how to get what we needed for evaluations and research, improving and verifying data quality, reviewing statutory and legal provisions related to data, protecting privacy and confidentiality, avoiding data breaches, linking data from different sources, paying for data, big issue, creating longitudinal files for evaluations and public use files for further analysis, coordinating with other agencies and departments to share data, and providing technical assistance and communication to state and local governments and local providers of program services. I could go on. Today, though, we're going to hear about some of the big issues currently at play around data and evidence. To kick off the discussion in a minute, we'll first hear from Dr. Erica Groshen of Cornell University's Institute for Labor Relations and former commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Then my colleague, Ryan Kelsey, will facilitate a panel discussion with research, evaluation, and data privacy people inside and outside of government. As federal agencies are now strengthening their evidence capacity and the infrastructure needed for rigorous evaluation and analysis, after the panel, we'll hear from Diana Epstein from OMB's Evidence Office. We'll talk today about how data figures into the capacity building around evidence and what is being done or could be done to improve the data structure, access, and security to strengthen the capacity to build evidence. Again, thanks for joining us today, and please submit comments and questions through the Q&A part of Zoom, and join the conversation if you wish at #LiveAtUrban. We really want to hear from you. And now we are very pleased to have Erica Groshen with us. She is a true expert on labor economics, government statistics, and yes, data infrastructures. Erica, the platform is yours.
Thank you, Demetra, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm here today to talk to you about some very important work, and let me see if I can advance. There we go. Excellent. That I've been engaged in as a member of a panel that was put out, a panel that was part of the Committee on National Statistics of the American Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And this report, and I'm showing you the cover of it right here, is the first of 3 reports, and it's really the vision report of the 3. And what it's talking about is what is the right vision for a 21st century national data infrastructure. What I want to talk to you about today is that report and some implications that this has for policy and program evaluations going forward. So I'm going to cover 4 basic things. A new national data infrastructure. What do we mean by that? What does that look like? What kind of vision, outcomes, and attributes do we have for this? And a key element in this is more blended data. So I'll spend some time talking about that, and then go on to implications for the world of program and policy evaluations, analytics in general for policy. This report was issued in October, late October, and I think it's going to be very useful and informative, kind of forming a common ground for discussions going forward. So first, let me say, what do we mean by national data infrastructure? Well, credible statistical information supports a democratic society, because in a democratic society, we are pushing decision-making down to the lowest possible level, to the most granular level. So this informs decisions by governments, certainly at the national level, but also state and local level. It informs decisions, statistical information informs decisions by businesses, by individuals. In that way, it's similar to roads and bridges, the way they support commerce by facilitating movement of goods, services, and people. Information facilitates good decision-making. And we all know that without good data to support decisions, we get what's technically known as lousy decisions, which don't give us the most resilient and lively and productive economy. So some examples of very important statistical information is information on unemployment, inflation, crime, health statistics, all of those things. And statistical agencies play a critical role in this because they collect input data in a way that nobody else can, and they provide these trustworthy statistics to all. Now, what do we mean by trustworthy statistics? Well, there are 4 or 5 very important attributes. They're intended to guide decisions. So the information has to be accurate, has to get it right. It also has to be objective, has to be free from bias and free from and people can't worry about it being biased for some ulterior motive. It has to be relevant, so information you can use for decisions. It has to be timely. You have to be able, it has to get out there quickly so it can inform decisions, and it has to be accessible both in the literal and the figurative sense of the word. Accessible, people can understand what it means, and also that they can find it. Now, our mid-20th century data infrastructure was, relied very heavily on surveys. In the mid-20th century, we had few other sources of information, and also the samples and the data could be designed directly to fit measurement needs. And at that point, response rates were very high. Other surveys were very rare, so you didn't have survey fatigue, and public service was more valued in the public and private sphere. And this growth of the surveys helped to really fuel the empirical social science research and evaluations that had never been possible before. So they were key for the development of all of this kind of analysis that we take for granted today. Unfortunately, though, we need a new 21st century data infrastructure because we face a very big threat. All survey response rates are falling. Business surveys, household surveys are all falling. This raises the costs of gathering that information, and it erodes the reliability of that information, raising the possibility of biases, and also just giving the data larger standard errors. You have more just survey volatility. So at the same time, we face an enormous opportunity. There's the explosion of big data. We have digitized operations and records and cheap, powerful computers. We have internet connectivity. We have all sorts of novel software. All of these give us a brand new and really powerful source of information that just wasn't there before. So an overall vision for a new 21st century data infrastructure takes into account these two factors, the threats and the opportunities. And the goal of this would be to improve the quality, the timeliness, the granularity, the usefulness of national statistics, to facilitate better research, and to support evidence-based policymaking. And how do you get there? It's by blending data from multiple sources. You want to overcome the limitations from any particular source by combining sources. So what is blended data? Well, the idea is to collect the data from multiple sources, to use surveys still. Surveys are not going to go away, but use them for what they're best suited for, and I'll add to it information from government agencies, from private aggregators and companies, from crowdsourcing even, and combine them, matching them, merging them, modeling, using predictive analytics to use the information from all these different sources. Now, this is not entirely new. GDP is fundamentally very much a blended product, as are productivity estimates, and local estimates of many kinds are actually based on this kind of blending. But in the 21st century, this is really going to be on steroids, or it needs to be, to really meet all of our needs. So what would be the outcomes of this new data infrastructure? Well, it means that our US information resources would be mobilized in a coordinated manner with a big vision overall. How do we bring it all together to provide the decision makers throughout our economy with the information they need? This means more timely, more granular and useful information, enhanced research insights, and evidence-based policy analysis. It also means that the data holders are incentivized to share data for statistical purposes, that we're paying attention to that and making sure that people have the right incentives so they do share data properly as much as is needed. This also includes a reformed legal framework that enhances privacy protections, so you reduce people's fear of sharing their data. And it has to operate in a transparent, high trust environment, or it won't operate at all. So when we think about what this new data structure infrastructure is going to be, it has a number of different components that all have to work together. So obviously the data assets are key to all of this, right? They have to be there. You also need the data related technologies in place, the hardware and the software to process this. You need people with the expertise to manage and use it. You need standards governing the data where it's collected. Make sure that that is done properly and consistently so that you can analyze it. Organizations you have to have organizations in place to manage that data infrastructure at various levels. And then you need the trust of the data subjects and the holders so that they participate in the creation and in sustaining this data infrastructure. Now those, you can only put those things together if you have the various attributes of the statistical system, right? And these attributes are in some ways building blocks also, but they're characteristics. They are the partial goals that feed into the larger goals. So you need safeguards and advanced privacy enhancing practices to minimize possible individual harm. So one of the reasons that firms and people don't participate in surveys is fear of individual harm, and that is never the goal of a statistical system. So those practices have to be in place. You have to emphasize that this is all about the statistical uses only for common good information, and that the results will be freely shared with all. It's not intended to enrich some other small sector. And you need to be mobilizing all the relevant assets, blending them into the aggregates, providing the benefits with benefits that are proportionate to the possible costs and risks. This will rest on reformed legal authorities to protect parties' interests, a governance framework that is transparent and effectively supporting the operations. You need transparency to the public about analytical operations using the infrastructure so they will trust it and understand what it means. And you need state-of-the-art practices for doing this to efficiently create more secure and more useful information. So that all of this is a tall order, but it's all doable. It does, however, have to overcome some barriers. One barrier is resources. This will not be free. Big data is not cheap. Actually, it's cheaper in some ways, but much more expensive in others. Right? There are also legal impediments in place against sharing data that need to be examined, and where they no longer serve us, they need to be reformed. There's a learning curve. We're just at the beginning of changing our data infrastructure in this way. So institutions and people need to learn. And we also have a challenge because our statistical system is fragmented, and this can interfere with the kind of mobilization of all the resources and the sharing that's necessary going forward. And then, of course, there are the privacy concerns that need to be dealt with, not by dismissing them, but by building them into the infrastructure so that we can protect people's privacy appropriately. Fortunately, we have made some progress towards this vision. the Evidence-Based Policymaking Commission, the Evidence Act, and the following ACDEB, all of these things have increased statistical agency access to federal administrative data, and they're on the way to creating the National Secure Data Service to facilitate more blending of data. Statistical agencies, academics, and tech firms are pursuing just a wide variety of really interesting initiatives to move us in that direction. And this report and the two that are going to follow it develop the overall vision and the near-term steps in this direction, and focus in particular on the private sector and state and local administrative data, because the Evidence Act is more focused on the federal administrative data. Now, let me talk just for a minute about implications for policy analysis and evaluations. For people doing work in this field, this means that more data sources are going to be available. But it also means that you will need to do more work in assessing suitability, advantages, and limitations of all of these sources. So, what information is actually in there, what fields are in there, what's the coverage, who is missing, what's the data quality, how complete is it? And particularly most non-survey data is going to be only partial in terms of the entire universe, right? And so you need to understand what parts of the universe are covered and what's not, and what kind of history do you have? Matching opportunities are going to be more and more important because blending depends on matching, right? And then the access terms, who gets access and why. All of these things suggest that government administrative data, which has the broadest coverage, most transparency, and reliable history and curation, those are likely to remain a key source for policy and program evaluations going forward. That's not true of every use of these data, but for these policy and program evaluations, I think that's true. Another very important thing is that going forward, data standards for employer-maintained employment and earnings records, often called wage records, could be hugely beneficial. So already in evaluations, there's been a strong movement from surveys to use of UI and a national directory of new hires wage records, moving to a world where these were more consistent among states, where there was more access for evaluations, where there was enhancement of those very sparse records now with important information like hours and job titles, start and stop dates, demographics, all right? This is what's going to really make evaluations better and more efficient, less costly going forward. There are multiple efforts in these directions. The BLS wage record pilot is a good example. Various states are working on this individually and in some groups, and the Jobs and Employment Data Exchange initiative by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation is pushing at this from the private sector side. So all of those efforts are coming together, I think, to raise the possibility that this will actually come to be. I think for evaluations also, it's very important to ensure that your voice is at the table to address particular needs. There are so many users of statistics. When I was head of BLS, we used to talk about how the users of official statistics were a mile wide and an inch thick. Right? And evaluators are part of that mile wide and inch thick, but you have particular needs. And so evaluators need to be at the table to address those particular needs. And there's also a very important role for people who do policy analysis to use their trusted voice to reinforce the high trust environment and support resources and response rates for the federal surveys that will continue to be important. And by this, I mean, you need to do things like, first of all, of course, decry political interference wherever it's seen. Independence of the statistical agencies and of research is necessary for trust to have influence. And then don't free ride. You need to be ready to speak up for evidence and for official statistics because they are the key input to so much of what you do. That means being willing to attest to trustworthiness. If you have any doubts, get the information that you need to support that. And there's a lot of help from statistical agencies to help you do that. You need to debunk attacks rather than quietly rolling your eyes. You need to cite your sources so that people understand where the information comes from. You need to, the institutions that you work with need to participate in federal surveys and encourage your stakeholders, your business associations, your professional communities to participate in these surveys so that we can sustain the response rates. You need to support funding and modernization of the statistical system, of this data infrastructure, if you want it to be modernized, right? And so there are some ways. There's the Friends of BLS, which you can join, and I have some information here. There's the Census Project is another way to support this. There's also, there are a number of organizations, the American Statistical Association works hard on this as well. So let me close with a few takeaways. The current national data infrastructure is ill-equipped to meet 21st century data needs. We all want more and better data. To get there, we need a data infrastructure that blends data from multiple sources to improve our statistics, to facilitate more rigorous science, social, and economic research, and to support evidence-based policy, program evaluations. And this progress is going to require new partnerships, a shared vision that we hope this report is part of, legislative action, consensus activities that move us toward the vision, and all of this will require help and guidance and a seat at the table for the evaluation community. So let me close by thanking you and providing the link to the report. And I look forward to hearing what all the colleagues have to say today. Thank you. Let me turn this over. I've forgotten now. Oh, Ryan. Yes, Ryan, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Erica, for laying out that compelling vision for us and the rationale for a data infrastructure for the country. I think we're going to go a little bit deeper now. That's the purpose of this next segment. So I'd like to welcome each of the panelists to go ahead and turn their cameras on. And while they're doing that, I will offer the briefest of introductions. Just starting with myself, my name is Ryan Kelsey. I'm the director of the Building America's Workforce Initiative at the Urban Institute. And with us today on the panel, we have Claire Bowen, Principal Research Associate and Statistical Methods Group Lead at the Urban Institute. We have Shelley Metzenbaum, founder of the Better Project. We have Irma Perez Johnson, who right now is an independent consultant, has a lot of expertise in program evaluation, and Brian Scholl, the Principal Economic Advisor and Senior Economist of the Office of the Investor Advocate at the SEC. If you want to know more about the panelists, just a reminder that the lengthier bios are available on the website. But we're just going to get right into it. I've got a number of questions to get the panelists started, but I would encourage anybody who's listening to be thinking about questions that you have for our panelists as well. And there'll be a certain point here in the program where I'll turn to those. But just to get us going, just as a little bit of a preamble, each of you panelists have been involved in evidence-based policies and practices, and you've been coming at this work from different perspectives and playing different roles in and out of government. And so we have an opening question just to sort of tee things up and get people's minds working. So what I hope each of you would do in turn, and we'll start with Claire, is just take a minute to let people know the main kind of data that you use in your work, whether that's program data, individual or survey data, public or restricted. I'll let you define the terms of your data use, but then if you could address what you would say are some of your most important data needs, and is that better quality, better access, specific data items, again, I'll let you each in turn set the terms for that, but just to get us started so people can get an idea of who else on the panel. So Claire, what are the important data needs? And I hope that you would touch on, statistical analysis, maybe a little on privacy. We'll have time to do more of that later.
Yeah, so Ryan's kind of prompting me because my specialty area is data privacy, in particular trying to figure out best practices to safely expand access to data. So some of the most important data sets I work with is administrative data, in particular to kind of echo what Eric has said. Survey response rates are all-time low across the board. So some people have been saying, hey, why don't we get access to administrative data that it's like higher quality, there's like certain features of it that haven't been accessed like otherwise with survey, or maybe we can combine it with survey data, as Erica has mentioned. But obviously that data, those kind of data sets can be very sensitive. In particular, one of the data sets I work with is taxpayer data, which I don't really need to go into too much detail to why you probably don't want people to know your sensitive taxpayer information. So that's one of the data sets I particularly work on. Another set of data sets I work on is like rural economic data. So just give a little background for some people. I actually grew up in a very rural area of Idaho, where I was in a town of 3,000 people, and that was the biggest town in the whole county that is the size of Connecticut. So having access to data to make certain kind of decision making in that very rural part of the country is very important. So I'm working with other federal agencies on how can we give equal access to that kind of like information that still, again, protects privacy, because being very identifiable as in like a small population, or being like into a more rural area, you can't identify those individuals. So I always use myself as an example as being Asian American, very identifiable in a very rural part of Idaho, whereas being in Washington, D.C. or in more heavily metropolitan area, it's easier to disguise my representation or disguise myself in those areas, but still preserve my representation, excuse me. So those are definitely those kind of privacy concerns. I guess another thing is another project I'm working on is like working with local government, because they don't have the kind of resources like federal agencies have. So how can we empower local agencies to have certain kind of tools to use data sets that they have been collecting and sharing it with other like NGOs or other places in their system to help and better people. So in particular, we're working with Allegheny County on looking at their health survey services data and trying to give to other nonprofits in the area. And then I think with that, I'm going to pause there and hand it off to my colleagues.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from Shelley next. Just again, using your program performance expertise, curious about the kind of data you're using and what needs you have.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks to Urban for bringing this terrific event together. So I come at this mostly from the performance measurement and management area, but let me give us a good, clarify what I mean by that. So too many people think about data in the performance measurement and management area as data that gets collected for annual reporting. That, frankly, is helpful, but not very useful. And the real issue here is getting performance measurement and other data used together for 4 purposes. First one is to inform where to focus, whether that is for setting short or long-term goals. It's really trying to get data that gets analyzed in statistically valid ways, but in the short term, sort of like, where do we focus now? The second is to find ways to improve. The third is, once you figured out what your goals are, how do you start to improve? And you need data to figure that out, whether it's to look for positive outliers or causal relationships or things like that. And then once you found ways to improve, it's to find ways to increase the adoption of better practices or products or providers, and to reduce the use of less good ones. And then finally, I think we need analyzed data to build trust and understanding of government, as well as those government funds. So those are 4 high-level uses of data. And then I'd also say in the performance management area, and this is an area where I think we need to, when it's done well, it's brilliant, and too often it's done as a compliance reporting exercise. You've got those high-level goals, whether it's COVID reduction or reduction of drug abuse, opioid use, and fentanyl abuse, safe drinking water, good jobs. All of these are high-level goals, but then it's also, okay, let me be more specific. For whom and where? And then you want it to be useful at the national level, but also at the state level, at the local level, within the local level in different neighborhoods. And how do you use that data so people say, what should my goals be here? And how do I improve? And then you want to use data to inform treatment design. So looking for the positive outliers and then seeing if you can replicate and get equally good results elsewhere, looking for causal factors, the correlations that you might be able to influence to bring about better results, looking for clusters or, patterns so you can treat collectively and do that in more cost-effective ways. But then I also want to point out there's the operational goals. So if I'm running a job training program and I'm getting big drop off in my enrollment numbers, I got a problem. If I've got different completion rates for different instructors, hey, I ought to pay attention to that. And then I ought to start to think about how do I tweak this in order to increase my enrollment and increase my completion rate and find better placements. So there's all sorts of data like that. And then there's contextual indicators. Hey, if I got a supply chain problem or a storm is coming, that may affect what's happening. If I'm dealing with COVID, might affect it. And then precursor events that are important to pay attention to. So think about your car dashboard. If my battery's running low or my gas is running low, that's data that tells me I ought to take an action. So and then there's things like processing times and error rates. So those are all the different kinds of data we use in performance management that can really make a huge difference, complementing the work that's done, statistical analysis that's done for both of, evaluations of different types of products, practices, providers, but then also to statistical analysis to make sure that where I'm focusing is in fact the right place to focus because I didn't get bias in the data that I was looking at.
Great. Well, that's a great start, Shelley. And you mentioned evaluation. I want to give Irma a chance now as our program evaluation person on this panel to talk about her data needs and the kind of data that she's looking for. Go ahead, Irma.
Hi there. Just sorry, was struggling to find the unmute button. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much. And it's just such a pleasure to be on this panel and to share the stage with all these wonderful scholars and researchers in their respective fields. In my view, we are all working in related areas, sort of all involved in sort of different pieces of an overall spectrum of learning about our policies and practices and and social policies and programs and what and what they yield. I have been primarily involved in the evaluation field for about 30 years. And what I would say is that program evaluation ultimately is about telling the story of a particular set of policies or programs, the who is served, what exactly is provided for whom, how do people actually move through the programs and the services. It's a little bit different from program performance management, is that we're trying to abstract from the available data, sort of to tell that story perhaps about a class of related programs or policies, not specifically sort of with an eye to managing for results, but just sort of tell the story. To what extent is this program achieving its goals, its aims, and relying on the best possible available data and evidence, sort of in objective information. So in my experience, the best information to tell the story would come from granular individual level transactional data that were generated over the course of actually running these programs and policies. But a big challenge is that the individual programs and policies that are funded by a given, a given programmatic stream or a given law don't typically collect sort of the same information in the same way. So as evaluators, we oftentimes have to come in and retrofit some process, or just piece it together as best we can, which is expensive, time consuming, and clearly sort of the next best deal. But not ideal. We also, as part of evaluations, want to look at the outcomes of programs. Again, The actual service delivery providers don't typically collect uniform, rich outcomes information on the people they serve. They focus more on the more proximal outcomes. Do people complete? Do they get to the end point of our program? Because following people is expensive and time consuming, and their funding streams don't necessarily include the resources to do that. Moreover, it's not sort of the primary focus of their frontline staff. And finally, I think a critical point of piece of information for good evaluation is information on the counterfactual, and that sort of what would be available to the people who are eligible for these programs of services if this particular program of service were not available. And that is something that routinely as evaluators we have to construct in some alternative way, because it's not readily available from our government or standard public sources. So for that reason, we tend to rely on surveys or MISs or other methods that, or collecting information from administrative records data on both a treatment and a control group, for example, UI data, or, sort of data on educational outcomes for treatment and control conditions. But there are many challenges involved in this, including getting access to PII, which then tends to require informed consent, which make the process very cumbersome and again just very challenging in the environment of general distrust for data collection and data examination. But anyway, those are all challenges we can get into in more detail.
Yeah, I was about to say, Irma, thank you. I think we'll have some barrier questions coming, and I appreciate we're already seeing some great questions coming in from the audience. But I want to round out this opening round with Brian, just looking at the kind of economic evaluations that you're involved in at the SEC. What would you add to what's been said so far?
Yeah, I guess the first thing to say is we're a little bit of an odd duck in our federal evidence program. So my group is a group I started a couple of years ago, coming over from the Senate, trying to basically change a 90-year-old government institution overnight. So a very easy task of doing that. We fill a lot of different roles that are filled in other parts of government. So we're sort of a behavioral nudge unit. We're an academic research group. We're a survey data collection group. We're an experiments group, an evaluation group. We have this function as an investor advocate, an independent investor advocate to the commission. And then we have these other roles that can interface with organizational management. So we have capacities and kind of footprint in a lot of different areas, and that makes it a little bit different than other parts of government. I mean, I think when I came over, there were sort of a lot of, the reason why we're set up the way we're set up is really looking at the landscape of the institution itself and seeing what the needs were and seeing what was feasible. So I don't really believe in one size fits all solutions to things. I probably would have designed our initiative differently if I were going into a different agency and faced with a different set of problems. But the SEC doesn't have traditional programs the way many other government agencies do. So we're not, sending checks to people or sending kind of care packages of some way or training programs to people. It's more indirect action through rules that are created to sort of bound financial market actions and sort of disclose information. So our beneficiaries are kind of indirect beneficiaries of the guardrails that the agency puts on. But when I came over, there was limited investor info. There was a limited voice for investors to be part of the policymaking process. Limited appetite for field experiments. I think one of the key things is, especially in the regulatory environment, but in other areas, government really needs to keep ahead of the curve, right? There's a lot of innovation going on in the economy. There's a lot of innovation going on in financial markets. I was kind of struck by Erica's presentation because I think that's a big part of what's underlying what she's talking about in terms of the new data that comes on board. But government needs to keep ahead of the curve. And so if the entities that you're regulating are, using the space shuttle and you're using rocks and stones, you're going to be inherently behind the curve. And so part of what we're doing is persistently trying to push the commission and push other agencies to kind of move ahead in this space. As far as the kind of data that we use I mean, the biggest thing that I can say first and foremost is that we use data appropriate to the research question. So although we have a really powerful data collection infrastructure, it's actually the research questions that are driving the data collection that we do, and not some predetermined decision about, we're going to do X number of surveys or something like that. We do a lot of survey, lab, and experimental work. A lot of our focus is on experiments. We do also do other things that are not classified in any of the things that anybody's talked about. So using machine learning to generate data in other ways. We use markets data as well. Most of the level of our analysis is at the individual or household level. Although we also do a lot of stuff with, at the firm level and that sort of stuff. So if we have an experiment, we might need to do some market analysis to understand what options to present to individual experimental participants. So we would need to use sort of market data for that. We also do some work with administrative data as well, although I prefer that were more ingrained in what we do. So I'll pause there and let the conversation continue a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, and thanks to everybody for orienting the audience to your particular areas. I want to go back to Claire because privacy is definitely a hot topic and top of mind for many when we're talking about this issue, and that's your area of expertise, Claire. So I'm curious, and Erica brought it up in her remarks, but given the some of what Brian was just saying about rapid technological advances, how organizations are using data and people's concerns about privacy and confidentiality, I'm wondering what advice you have for how those concerns can be protected while also, doing your job, like helping everybody that's in the evaluation capacity do their job effectively and, advanced decision making given those concerns about privacy and confidentiality.
So I'm going to start off with that there is no silver bullet. There are different kinds of solutions for different kind of applications. And that's because if I were to tell a dozen different people, hey, tell me what you think data privacy is, you're going to get a dozen different answers. Then you're going to say, hey, what is data equity? You're also going to get a dozen different answers, right? And that goes into data accuracy. And so you can see this trend here, why there's going to be a different kind of solution for different applications, because you have to first figure out the communication among all the parties and say, what is the definition of privacy? What is the definition for the data equity aspect of that data to make sure that maybe is it equal access, or does that mean equal privacy protections for all individuals or records in that data? What does it mean by making sure it's accurate? Because there's this natural tension between all these different aspects. You can't have all privacy and all the usefulness of the data or all the equity all at the same time. Something has to give and take. So one of the solutions, obviously, is that you have to have this open communication among all the different parties that are all going to have to be considered. And when you say different parties, that also goes into another equity aspect of whose voice is going to be heard at the table. And so just trying to figure out how are we going to continue on this conversation. Now, actually going into the different technologies that could possibly be used into figuring out how we can think holistically to have better access to this data. There's a lot of different techniques coming into play. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but it's been a buzzword in my space, so maybe not a buzzword for others, is using what's called differential privacy or formal privacy. It's a new definition of privacy that is more transparent because you assume the absolute worst case scenario. But when you do that, you're going to alter results more aggressively, to the point that some people have brought up that, well, main criticism is now my data is not useful at all for what I want to do. So there's that part of technology that's coming into play. Another one is synthetic data has also been becoming more popular to try to create a data set based on the statistical aspects of the data. So, but creating what we call fake or pseudo records based on a statistical model or some underlying other statistical underlying features like I mentioned before. So another thing is doing some sort of validation server or verification server. So this is a little bit tricky, and this goes into something that Erica mentioned, this National Secure Data Server. So the idea is to have some sort of server, sorry to reuse another word, the same word in the definition, that has the confidential data where you as the user say, hey, I want to run this analysis. And so you submit that analysis to the server and the server will run it, but then give you a noisy answer back. Now, a validation server is one that will give you that noisy answer, maybe with some like full inferences, like some standard errors around the analysis that you want. There's also like a verification server, which is supposed to like verify your results if when you apply that analysis to a publicly available data, like a synthetic data set. So I think I got a little bit in the weeds right there, but those are just like some of the technologies and maybe some keywords that people can look into further or ask more questions about later.
No, thank you, Claire. And I want to offer other panelists a chance to also comment. I think we'll go to Shelley first. Go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, so I think this is a great question about the confidentiality and the privacy when you're talking about data sharing. And I just wanted to add for consideration as we all move forward, the impact of data sharing, for making data sharing agreements where you think about the motivational effect of data sharing. So way too often, whether it's a federal program or other kinds of programs, we think about rewarding or penalizing using the data. In the workforce area, there used to be the bonuses and everybody, all the analytic brain power went to negotiating what the targets would be so I could get a bigger bonus, right? And then what we've done in K-12 is we've made the teachers afraid of the data because we penalized with the use of the data. So I think as we move forward, we need to get increasingly sophisticated on what the appropriate and inappropriate uses and how we share data so it supports continuous and learning and improvement. So we return data to data suppliers with value added through analysis instead of getting them to think this is just a reporting exercise. So I just wanted to add that dimension as we think about this going forward.
Great. Irma, did you also want to add on?
Yeah, just quickly, Ryan, thank you so much. I wanted to say that I think in my view, it's just really important to move towards a more balanced regulatory environment around the generation and use of data. I'm just continuing to be struck by how in the private sector, like industries, private companies have recognized the value of data and really sort of like examining the data sort of to improve the services and the products they deliver, to the point that they're using our private information without us really knowing about to gather insights into the services they offer and how we'll respond and, sort of better tailor the products that they make available and even sort of gather the information across companies and services that then sell it to each other sort of to make further decisions and, information to guide their decision making as industries and businesses. I think what we're talking about is in the public sector, we want to do the same almost, but with a recognition that the insights, the learnings from this use of data are in essence a public good. They're about learning about the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of our social policies, our programs. And like anything that is in essence a public good, I'm putting on my, my economist hat here. As a society, as an individuals, we're likely to underinvest in it because the returns are not just sort of like privately held, but rather they benefit everyone. And I think this is a really useful framework to think about investments in the use and generation of data on our social policies and programs. I just want to put it, sort of put that out there as sort of as an important like framework to think about use and generation of data within the public sector.
Yeah, and Irma, let's just stay with you for the next question, which is kind of gets into infrastructure a little bit. Given that you talked about just now about public data and the need for it, I'm curious if you were wearing your researcher hat, what would make it easier for researchers to get what they need in this context?
So I love this question because it gives me an opportunity to kind of almost put on my queen for the day, or if I had a magic wand, sort of
what do you got?
Hat on. And I do have a couple of ideas. Some of them may very well be very pie in the sky, but that I think could be real game changers in terms of the process of generating and making information uniform, more widely uniform and broadly based information to then help us better understand the efficacy and cost effectiveness of our social policies and programs. One of them, and it's not really about the data, the data itself, but it's the process that we use to generate data, is just moving towards more universal and shared application processes for our social policy support and social support programs. Think, for example, free and reduced price lunch, Pell Grants, or even unemployment insurance, and then, sort of like the other types of services that people who need those supports tend to also need, like TANF, supplemental nutrition assistance, housing assistance, even child tax credits, as well as auto verification and renewal of eligibility based on, instead of individuals providing information all over again, perhaps wage records or income tax returns. This is all information that are being collected by various government agencies or public programs, but in a very piecemeal, granular way. Again, sort of like moving towards more universal and shared application and eligibility processes could generate uniform, already linked data about a wide range of public policies and programs. I think importantly, this would make it easier for our citizens to apply for many of these supports as they qualify, that when they qualify at times of need, and potentially improve the outcomes of many of these investments and save money by reducing administrative costs and letting people actually focus on, what it is that they're trying to accomplish instead of needing to provide similar information in different ways to different agencies at different points in times. Another kind of pie in the high, this is again a potentially pie in the sky idea, but and I think we'd have to overcome some attitudes and beliefs about the deservingness of the poor and people in need, and sort of attitudes about the desire to reduce and limit participation in social programs because of narratives about widespread fraud and mismanagement, which in my experience tend to be largely overblown. When you actually look at the prevalence of waste and mismanagement, it's much smaller than it tends to be portrayed. Some quick other ideas include guidelines of standards. If we're not moving towards sort of broad-based, uniform, universal application and eligibility, at least providing some guidelines and standards for programs of the same type for the minimum types of data that they could collect, ideally paired with federal investments in the kinds of platforms or databases to collect these data. It is very costly for individual programs to devise and collect these platforms, these systems. That's why we tend to underinvest and be stuck with the infrastructure that we currently have to deal with. And then just quickly, finally, and this is a direction we're already moving in, is more like a national network of independent centers to support and safeguard the collection and linking of data, which would take this out of the individual studies and evaluations. This would also be potentially an important game changer in our field.
Great, thank you, Irma. I'm curious, Brian, to hear from you. If you were to be the king for the day, to take Irma's queen metaphor, if you're in charge, what are some of the things you'd like to see?
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit maybe on a different track, which is sort of just institutional incentives across government and across agencies, because I think there's the infrastructure piece to something, which is kind of building the bridge or road, but then there's the actual usage and that sort of stuff. So if you build a bridge going over the wrong river, then it won't be used that well. And I think kind of the most fundamental thing is just to continue to build incentives into the system for people to be able to appreciate evidence and use evidence more broadly. And I think that oftentimes happens at a leadership level within agencies. So introducing a robust culture of evidence within the agencies, but also just transforming the culture broadly in agencies. I think in my group, I mean, we've built tremendous infrastructure for collecting data and for using data. but it's still kind of an ongoing challenge to change the way processes work in a 90-year-old institution. So I really think of this work as being, as Irma was saying, it's a public good. The data is a public good. The evidence is a public good. But I think that it's not. There are many pockets in which it's not being used that way. So I think we need to continue to build incentives for it to be used. That could be at the ground level for those sorts of incentives to be put into, individual performance plans, or just part of each agency's sort of performance evaluation on its own, just the evaluatory process. I think one could do that by pushing more towards having outcome indicators for agencies themselves rather than output indicators. It's sort of been a long-term battle that we've been waging all across the government. But if you have output indicators, then it kind of stovepipes what you're doing, and it kind of confines you to just the delivery of the activities that you're reporting on. If you have outcome indicators, then you have to think more seriously about what you're doing and try and get better at it. And I'll just say that finally, I mean, all of this is not only a public good, but it's back to what Erica was saying. It's critical for democracy to function properly. If government is just doing the wrong thing, people don't necessarily recognize that this program is off or that program is off. Some of the beneficiaries directly will understand that, but they just get a sense that something is amiss. So if you're pouring resources into an agency and into an organization and not getting some kind of results, people inherently get a sense that things are not working right. And then they start to question, hey, why do we have that agency? Why do we have that government institution? It's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. So we've always viewed this in my group as fundamental to the functioning of governance and trust in government and democracy itself. So I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, I saw Shelley responding favorably to what you were saying, so I wanted to give her a moment to add on, and then we'll move on to our next topic. Go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ryan, Brian, for talking about we need to move toward outcomes. I do think one of the big challenges is to align the government incentive systems to be organized around outcomes, and probably outcome teams, et cetera, and not the individual incentive systems we currently have. They really don't work. So whether it's outcome teams or in some cases it's process teams, because when you're doing risk management programs, many similar processes. But I also wanted to bring up another, in terms of Irma, I just loved your comments, is, pie in the sky. And, if I were queen for a day, I love those. One is, let's figure out how to tap new technologies so that you can support this kind of outcome focused improvement. So I just want to mention two. Think about the platforms we can use, government can build that support this kind of collaboration. So performance.gov just took a giant baby step forward by tagging the goals with budget themes. The themes aren't as sophisticated as they need to be, but 3 cheers, we'll be hearing from Diana later, to the folks with the learning agenda who actually tagged the learning objectives by those budget themes, so you can sort on them and you can start to look at it and say, does this make sense? But also, how do I find the other people who are working on that in government? Who else has knowledge that's relevant? So that's one platform where I think we've got progress, but we have, we're like not even in kindergarten yet. We have to get to past graduate school, but let's keep going. We're going in the right direction. Healthypeople.gov is another platform that's very interesting. It's got the goals, it's got the evidence, it's got the links to the data sets. The problem is not enough folks are using it to actually manage with, to decide, hey, how does this fit with my organization's goals? So tapping new technologies like that, resourcing and using platforms, resourcing and using continuous learning and improvement communities. So right now, you can't find who else in the government is working on the outcomes you're working on. Let's create those kind of networks, but also, just as has happened for some of the states and the local governments, let's build networks around is networks around outcomes, networks around similar processes, but that means we need to fund the creation if they don't already exist, but then the nurturing of those networks. It's always happened much better in traffic safety than in other fields. And then finally, I'd say much greater use of user-centered design when we're sharing evidence and data. Too many of the evidence repositories, the data, we want the front line to use it. We got to start to think about the questions they're asking and start to think about user-centered design on the evidence we found. I just read about 2 new startups that are actually trying to do this, so that we're not far from this. We're moving, I think, on the right trajectory, but we got a long way to go.
Great, thank you, Shelley. I'm about ready to shift to audience questions, but I've got one lightning round question for each panelist, just to briefly, emphasize briefly, respond to around challenges. So we've just done the dream big segment. Now it's the, well, what's stopping us from achieving some of these objectives that we've got? So, Erica mentioned a bunch of them at the top: acquisition of data, privacy. We've already discussed some functional issues with the data, data management, funding, resources. The list goes on. I'm going to start with, we're going to do Irma, Brian, Claire, and Shelley. Just give me what's a clear challenge and set of advice you might have around that challenge that you might be able to offer others. I was thinking for Irma, it's this balancing act of, well, we want the maximum dollars going out for work, but we want to know if what we're doing is working.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe that's the one for you. I don't know. You're welcome to take another direction if you like.
No, that's perfect, Ryan. And thank you so much. I think, what I would offer is that kind of as a network of like related scholars, sort of policymakers, service providers, kind of as a community, we should try to move towards like collectively, like efficiently working together to efficiently overcome roadblocks to the systemic collection, maintenance, and analysis of data to support the efficacy and cost effectiveness of our social programs and policies. This requires sort of not just, again, this perspective that this is a public good. This is something that is in everybody's interest to do, but also a systemic perspective. And I have a great example of this. Many of our statutes and regulations sort of prevent the kind of linking and use of information from one particular program, let's say unemployment insurance, to support the evaluation of related services, like, for example, employment and training programs in a different sector. This is what I mean by bringing this systemic perspective. And as we look at the reauthorization of particular laws or pieces of legislation, or the update of regulations, we need to bring this more systemic perspective to thinking about the process by which we generate, use, and then support the analysis and safeguarding of data to support these public purposes. I'll just leave it at that.
I appreciate it.
In the interest of time.
Brian, what are the examples you'd want to bring forward, a challenge that you think needs more attention, and how you would face it?
Yeah, thanks. I'll give just example I've seen in a lot of agencies, which is just data use is just oftentimes very difficult and fraught, even if it's not high risk for the organization. So there oftentimes tends to be a lot of emphasis on very low risk, solving very low risk problems that have essentially, even if they materialize, they would have very little consequence, and less attention to maybe the larger risk institutional challenges that I've mentioned before, which is solving problems in society. And if you don't solve problems in society, then people lose trust and faith in government. So I'd also like to see just a little bit more attention to creating parameters by which researchers internally can use work more easily, so use research and data more easily. So for example, we are able to collect non-sensitive data very, very easily, but it's sometimes a challenge for us to actually make use of that data in a way that is most beneficial to the public, which would be publicly using that data. So that kind of challenge is there, just an adherence to scientific integrity principles, so that, research just doesn't become a political football. That independence of research is really has to be critical to what we do, because if it's not, there are ways for political influences to come in to affect what data gets out, what data is collected, what research is done. So continue to make that independent. So over.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Claire, what would you put forward?
Put forward education, educating the next generation about these needs, data access, data privacy. Everything is about data science right now. It's like one of the fastest growing degrees, but a lot of students are not being taught about the aspects of that data has to be protected. How do you provide the proper access for that data? And then who gets access, who gets to have a say about how that data is being provided and collected, so on and so forth. And it's a big thing for me, being I'm trained as a statistician, that data privacy methodology isn't really taught until graduate school, and then if that at computer science programs. And as we have heard from everybody, that this is a huge ecosystem of different perspectives that we need to have people come to the table at. So this education piece is really important. So we shouldn't have it just siloed into like certain sections. It should be taught everywhere. And also kind of echoing for what we kind of hear is that we also need to train people too. So not just rely on the next generation to train them up, but we also have to train the current staff members who are working on this.
Great. And Shelley.
Yeah, so, if I think the biggest challenge is the screwed up incentive system we have, especially for personnel, individual incentives, but also organizational, like with grant incentives. And we need to shift to rewarding teams for individuals that are organized around outcomes or similar processes like benefits processing, loans, things like that. Instead of the individual incentive system that we have now, which just doesn't rewards you to sort of build your own little empire. And then I think we need to change accountability expectations so that what we're holding people and organizations accountable for are the four things I said at the beginning. Using data and evidence to inform where you focus, find ways to improve, increase adoption of better practices and reduce use of less good ones, and build, which means communicating in a way so that the public understands that, so the funders understand that, et cetera. Instead of, did you make your targets or did you do better than others, and ranking and rating and all that kind of nonsense we do that we don't do in a very sophisticated and often in unfair ways.
All right, thank you all. Now for my favorite part, the audience question segment of our session. And the first one, we'll do as many as we have time allotted until they yank us from the stage here. But the first one, which I'll just ask for a volunteer who wants to address it, is when we focus on reconfiguring, reprioritizing, and optimizing our data for better innovation, what incentive or requirement regulation might we imagine or put in place across these different information silos that you all have been talking about? That's my paraphrasing, in order to allow better communication. Shelley, you just talked about incentives, so I don't know if you have a deeper example there. You want to let someone else go? It's up to you. Yeah.
I said it, so I'll pass.
Yeah, great. Irma, go ahead. Nope, Irma, we're not hearing you. Can you try to unmute there? Yeah,
sorry. Yeah, that's better, right?
Yeah, we got you.
Yeah, I just quickly, the way I tend to think about it is sometimes before you can institute broad-based incentives to get, sort of a whole class of actors to move in a particular direction, it's just really critical to establish proof of concept. Why is this valuable? How do people benefit when they do it? And this is why, for example, some of the suggestions I have are more about building the infrastructure and establishing these laboratories or these examples of how this can be done, that then become the model for broad-based adoption of these practices in many places. Moreover, there's important learning. We're not going to get this right away, immediately. So, just again, moving perhaps more towards in a framework of piloting innovation and establishing proof of concept for how to do this more effectively within the public sector, I would offer, could be really critical.
Brian or Claire, anything to add, or we can go to the next one? Ready to move? Okay, next one. because data responses are falling, I think what we mean is survey data, I think is the intent there. How can we create a space where more organizations are sharing primary data, and if secondary data is used, how can we ensure that that data is coming from credible sources?
I think this is one area where administrative data would help out more. So creating kind of broad collections of administrative data repositories that are actually functionally usable across, let's say, agencies or groups. I know that there has been some effort to even share administrative data across government agencies, and that alone is sometimes fraught. There's not a really great practical way of making that happen oftentimes because there are just limitations on what can be shared. But as far as the reduced response rate, that is one issue that may be helpful.
Shelley.
Yeah, so, and I think there may be opportunities here. This goes back to, if I think my data, I'm sharing my data is going to get me in trouble, whether it's locally through embarrassment or nationally because it's going to threaten my grant, I'm going to be very reluctant to share it. So I think the challenge now is for us to figure out, I think you would get a lot more, folks working on these things. And I think about the K-12 area all the time because there's all these stories about these better projects that are going on that the newspaper covers. And yet no one's following up on those stories to sort of look at the data. And if you don't protect the data provider, then they're going to be afraid that they could get in trouble, whether it's at the local, state, or national level. And so we need to figure out our way through this so that it's safer to share data, to learn from, and to find ways to improve.
Yeah, Shelley, I'm going to build on that, where I think we also need to have this conversation of like, what are we comfortable with, right? What is, like, at what point do we sacrifice our personal privacy for like a public good? Because as society, our data, like the data landscape in general and computational landscape, just it's exploded and changed so rapidly. And I think we actually had a nice conversation about what are we comfortable with. I mean, most people, it seems, are comfortable with their smartphones collecting all sorts of information for the convenience of having a smartphone, right? But we're not comfortable with the government collecting certain kind of information, though. So having those, reevaluating these societal norms about what we do with data is something that I think will help progress that conversation of like what is trustworthy or not.
Great. I'm just going down the list. There's a couple other related ones along those lines, but I'm going to shift us to one that's thinking about the different data set problem, which might be an Irma question. Here it is. Different data sets may use different definitions for what the data are measuring. And so what challenges do you envision for trying to achieve this blended state that Erica was talking about in the opening? Irma, would you mind starting that one off?
Yeah, I think that is a great springboard for that suggestion I had of, again, data dictionaries, having guidelines, sort of like just resources for particular types of program operators, administrators to follow, or even sort of making available like standardized, already uniform, like universal access, voluntary use, but standardized platforms that would provide sort of some uniform standards for collecting this information. So piggybacking on Claire's wonderful suggestion, in exchange for your getting used to this like wonderful like resource and not having to create it on your own, we would get access to the information, we would manage it with the appropriate safeguards. But the idea is like, we're making your lives easier. Oftentimes this information greatly overlaps with the kinds of data that Shelley was describing as being necessary for strong program performance management. Sort of program evaluation is a very close cousin of, performance management and administration. So, I mean, it's like this, again, this is a public good. It's all in our interest. And the more we can think about the critical elements of a strong infrastructure to support the right evidence-based ecosystem we want to move forward, the better off, we'll all be. I hope that's
No, that's great. Yeah, I'm going to keep us going through more questions if we can. I apologize, not everybody gets a chance to add on to each of these, but this one is, how do researchers see the linking of administrative data at the state level, including education data working, which is privacy protected under FERPA? Claire, you've been our privacy person here. I'm wondering if you might take a shot at this one. Like, what do people need to be thinking about here?
So I saw some other questions like in the chat because I had it on the side. And one of the biggest barriers for us to link these data sets of people saying like, I want more demographic data, I want to link that with education, is all these laws. Like there is FERPA, but there's of course HIPAA, there's Title 13, Title 26, CIPC, so on and so forth. And so all these different laws govern how we should protect different kinds of data sets. And so what is like the biggest barrier is like, well, they don't talk to each other, or agencies have to renegotiate every fiscal year to merge some of their data sets. Or some of the things is that like, yeah, we can share this part of the data, but you have to destroy it at the end of the year. So then that becomes an issue of like, well, what if we're trying to see trends over time, right? So that becomes a huge limitation. So I guess like my big thing is just, we need to figure out how can we restructure some of our laws, or at least update or reevaluate them. And then my final plug is that there is no federal law on consumer data, by the way. So that's something we should also be thinking about.
Interesting. All right. So someone put a question in that was what I had intended to have us end on, and that was to just thank you all for your commentary here, and to try to leave a closing message for our audience today from each of you. So we only got time for about 30 seconds each, but I'm curious if you could make one change to try to improve data and its use for public policy. What would be that one thing that you want to make sure people heard one more time? Or if you haven't said it yet, this is your chance to get it in. And we'll start with Shelley.
Well, what I'd start with is useful, 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 which means thinking about the users and the uses, and then making sure that what you do, don't just hope it's useful, actually make sure the way you're communicating the information, sharing it, in fact is, and find way and collect data that helps you find ways to improve those uses.
Great. And then we'll go to Brian, and then Irma and Claire to round us out.
I'll cheat and say two things. One is, again, pushing on the outcomes indicators, because once you reorganize according to outcomes, then the rest, I think, is going to follow. There'll just be pressure on everybody else to use data, to make use of it, to have more research and evidence out there. Second thing I would just say is just for a lot of these privacy and other issues, it's really kind of providing a safe space where data can be warehoused and used. So, I mean, most of us don't really need the individual identifiers or any PII to do our research. We just need it, some amount of that temporarily, to link it to another data set, and then all that information can be tossed out. So figuring out ways to have a safe space where we could operate, preserve the confidentiality and safety of the data, but then be able to get the research done that an actual researcher wants to do.
Great. Irma.
So for me, I think it would be, collectively a shift towards this very strong understanding and belief in the availability, the generation, availability, and use of data on our social policies and programs as a public good. And, and again, the recognition that with any public good, we're likely to underinvest, not necessarily recognize the long-term and widespread, broad-based sort of benefits of this, so that then, with that insight in mind, we as a society, as governing bodies, administrative institutions, and even the researchers themselves, and all the actors in the ecosystem, we act accordingly.
And Claire, you get the final word.
I think just what I just said before, which is like a streamlined system with all these different privacy laws. It'd be nice if there was like one universal one that we all are governed by, and that the agencies did not have to renegotiate every single time.
Great. Well, thank you all, Shelley, Claire, Irma, and Brian, for your time today. And thank you to the audience for your excellent questions. I'm now going to turn the microphone over to Diana Epstein from the Office of Management and Budget, where she's the evidence team lead, and she's going to offer some closing remarks. Diana.
Great. Well, just want to reiterate, thank you so much to all the speakers today. This was really a fantastic panel and a great event. You know, it's really exciting to hear this conversation. It reinforces for me what an opportune time this is for us to collectively be talking about using data for building different kinds of evidence. You know, it's been a busy few years for data and evidence for those of us in the federal government, as you could tell from the speakers. The Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, which was referenced, or the Evidence Act, has been an important focus of our efforts for the past about 3.5 years now. You know, of course, this didn't start from scratch, but it did create this new paradigm for agencies to more strategically think about how they build and use evidence. And, you know, it did require agencies to produce multi-year learning agendas. A couple of our speakers referenced those, which, you know, think of it as a strategic evidence building plan, as well as annual evaluation plans. As you heard today, we face a lot of challenges. These are tough questions where we need more evidence, and there's many different types of evidence that can help to answer these questions. We've been clear about that from the start. Where I sit at OMB, evidence isn't a hierarchy. One type of evidence isn't better than another, but it does depend on the question being asked and the evidence and the methods that are best suited to answer that question. You know, if you haven't seen these learning agendas yet, please go to evaluation.gov. We've linked everything in one central location. This is a really huge milestone to have these plans done. It's the culmination of a lot of hard work by our dedicated civil servants across the government. On that site, we've also launched this interactive dashboard of all the learning agenda questions across agencies. So you can sort and search by topic and by focus area, depending on what you're most interested in. It's very exciting that we've identified these priority questions. We have these evidence building plans in place, but of course we need to execute on those plans. We need to build evidence in many other areas as well. And data is, you know, of course, key to building more and better evidence that can be used to help decision makers solve tough problems. To that point, I just want to make sure those listening today are aware that the standard application process, which is part of Title III of the Evidence Act, is now live on researchdatagov.org. This is a big milestone for the statistical system. There's now a single front door for finding and requesting data access from statistical agencies for evidence building purposes, without needing to already know which agency houses the data you need or navigating various agency websites and request processes. We've come a long way over the past few years, but we still have a lot more work to do. We need those of you who are listening today in the academic, research, and philanthropic communities to think about how your work and your research might align with the questions we're asking and how your work can be policy relevant. My office at OMB has been partnering with the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House on a year of evidence for action, where we've been exploring and encouraging different ways that the federal government can collaborate with others to build and use evidence. So we want to hear your ideas. We want to hear your ideas and examples of using good data, putting evidence to action. We have a mailbox that we check every day. There's a human that looks at this every single day. And I would really welcome your good thinking on the topics discussed today, as well as other ideas about how we can use data, translate that into evidence, and put that evidence to good use. So if you want, please do reach out. It's evidence@omb.eop.gov. All right, and with that, I will pass it back to our host at Urban for the final closing.
Thanks, Diana. I'm Basha Katz. I'm a research analyst here at the Federal Evidence Forum here at Urban, and we want to thank you all so much for joining us virtually this afternoon. A big thank you to all the wonderful presenters and panelists for your helpful insights on data infrastructure issues for evidence-based policy and practice. We also want to especially thank the Annie E. Casey Foundation for their generous support of the forum. If you enjoyed this event and would like to learn more about our work, please check out the Federal Evidence Forum at the link in the chat. We host public forums like this one related to all aspects of evidence and evaluation, as well as producing briefs and blogs. We also have some resources to provide consultation, webinars, or briefings for individual agencies, so let us know if we can help you as you implement the Evidence Act. On our website, you can also sign up for our periodic newsletter to stay up to date on our events and publications. A video recording of this event will be available online soon. Thank you all again so much for being here today, and we hope to see you at a future forum soon.